Okay, here we go on 3.3. These are all derivatives, product rule, quotient rule in this section, so let's get to it. Number one, we want to look at f of x equals x cubed plus 5. Two different ways. So we want to take the derivative directly using the product rule and also by multiplying out first. So if I do the product rule here, it's the first times the derivative of the second plus the second times the derivative of the first. And if I simplify, I get 3x to the fourth plus 2x to the fourth plus 5, 10x. 5 times 2 is 10. And so that gives me 5x to the fourth plus 10x. That's the derivative using the product rule. And then if I distribute this out first and then take the derivative, I get f prime of x equals x to the fifth plus 5x squared. I'm sorry, that's f of x. And then I take the derivative, and I get 5x to the fourth plus 10x, which is of course the same thing. Sometimes it's easier to multiply first, depending on the functions. Other times you don't have a choice but to do the product rule. Number 3, f of x equals x e to the x. So f prime of x is the first times the derivative of the second plus the second times the derivative of the first, which is 1. You have to recognize initially that, oh, that's a product. So I can leave it like that, or I can factor out e to the x and it becomes x plus 1. That's probably a little simpler looking and easier to use down the road. So there we go. 6. Y equals t squared plus 3 e to the t. So y prime is the first times the derivative of the second, e to the t, plus the second, e to the t. Derivatives of e to the t are nice. Times the derivative of the first, 2t plus 0. So that becomes, let's see, if I factor e to the t out, that becomes a t squared plus 3 plus 2t. And usually we write that as e to the t in descending powers plus 2t plus 3, so that'd be y prime. Here we go. Number 9 is a quotient, x over e to the x. So I'm going to write that, or do that as f prime is the bottom times the derivative of the top minus the top times the derivative of the bottom, all over the bottom squared, e to the x, the quantity squared. So if I simplify, I can factor e to the x out of the numerator, and I get 1 minus x. The denominator has e to the x squared is e to the x times e to the x, so those cancel. So I get 1 minus x over e to the x. And last, number 10, g of x is similar. So g prime of x is the bottom times the derivative of the top, 50x minus the top times the derivative of the bottom, all over the bottom squared, e to the x squared. So I factor e to the x out, it cancels with one of these in the bottom. So I get 50x minus 25x squared all over e to the x. I could factor a 25x out and so forth if we want to at some later date. But that's easier to just recognize and see than factoring the e to the x's out. So there we go on that. Let's go to the next one. Actually, I tell you what, we'll cut it there, and I can just do it page at a time.